Hey everyone, welcome back to Big Strong Book. I'm Reed, and today we're going over 2666 or 2666 or 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. This book is, of course, a long time coming for me, just as a reader in general, but also for this channel too. Started with Roberto Bolaño, and every time I end up working my way back to him, it feels like a major next step forward, a chance to reflect, but also great to finally get around to this. This is one of the great, I think, white whales of postmodern lit, certainly of 21st century lit, in the reputation it has acquired over the past little over, I think, 20 years now since it was published, originally in Spanish. What it means for Bolaño's legacy, this being his final written work, not final published. And just in how it's able to kind of try to dig into the role of art in literature in a cold and callous world. And this was also a book, too, that Bolaño, I think, wrote knowing that he was very well running up against the clock of his own life. And that adds a lot to consider just in terms of going into this novel. So, you know, where to approach, where to even start with this book. I think it's important to kind of understand that the circumstances of Bolaño's life, as I had mentioned, Bolaño, I forget if he had died from kidney or liver failure, or if he was seeking a kidney or a liver transplant. But he was writing this book, I'll refer to it as 2666, and he had envisioned this big 900-page book to be split into 5 short novels. He viewed it would bring in more money for his estate, for his heirs. I assume his heirs were probably his children, although I don't know that for sure. But in the end, after he had passed away, because this is a posthumous novel, the estate, his heirs, whoever was in charge of making that decision, they decided to go for a singular one whole big volume. All the 5 somewhat, all the 5, they're connected, but they are somewhat disparate and individual. The 5 sections of this book, the 5 parts. They decided to publish it all together, which I think was the right call. It would have been too strained had it been 3 or even 5 separate volumes. I would rather just tackle the entire big work. But I will say just right off the bat here, as with the short stories of Bolaño that I read, as with when last year I read By Night in Chile, Bolaño's prose style is something that I feel like it takes a while to get used to, especially if you're completely unfamiliar with it. It is almost an detached omniscient, an uncaring omniscient, one a narrator, a presence over the whole scope of the story that investigates deeply, but in almost a removed sort of way, which in this book very well could be kind of the high watermark of his style, is resident in part 3, the part about the crimes, and then the narrative, but then he has a narrative flourish, which even raises that up in part 5, the final part. And in many ways, not only, I think, a capstone just on this work, but in the work of his that I've read so far. Of course, I should note that I have not read the entirety of The Savage Detectives yet. A long time ago, I read the first part all the way through, and then when it got into when the narrative got more disjointed and I wouldn't say disconnected because it was centered around a common core. When it got a little more Cortazarian, shall we say, in its approach, that's where the narrative lost me. I didn't I think it was just too much, and there were other things that I wanted to get to, and I was probably honestly just a little impatient. I will certainly return someday soon to The Savage Detectives, don't know when, because there's a lot of other things I want to get on my plate, and I was glad that I was able to finally get through this and get through it on a first attempt too. That's always very, very key. So getting into what this book is about. Goodness, I feel like what this book is about, what this book is trying to cover. I wrote down some notes, and as I've said before, when I read a book for the first time, I don't take notes while I'm reading. That may be a foolish thing for me to not do, to refrain from taking notes, but I can't. I feel like once I see the fullness of where a text of where a work is going, then I can start to look back on it. I feel like if you start to take notes on a first read, when you're in the middle of it, sure, it might aid your retrospective viewing of it after you have finished, but you might be well off the mark from where the book is truly going. There's a lot that I feel like if I was taking notes in part 1 and part 2 of 2666, I would have been way off the mark come the descendant of the ice cream maker at the end of the book, or the end of the great end of part 5. Now, I've just jotted down some key elements that this book discusses. Of course, I may be well off the mark, which is such. Bolaño knew what he was doing through and through within constructing this. I don't know if this is a complete work, and of course there is, I think, some debate lingering out there as to whether or not Bolaño still had a lot to edit if he was going to chop it down significantly. But this book deals in many respects with the notion of legacy, both a legacy of, it is the legacy of the act of the human, the act of the person, and that's kind of split into the act of the person in regards to violent action versus artistic action, and within that, Bolaño explores the residuals of those actions, particularly the search for meaning as it pertains to violence, the search for meaning as it pertains to art, and where we as people typically tend to place our interest and place our focus, and oftentimes it's not in either one. We often have an interest in the unexplained absurds as opposed to unexplained brutal violence, especially violence related to death. And this book centers at its central core, where all these parts, even if they start quite disparate, the place where they converge is the fictional Mexican town of Santa Teresa, and which is a stand-in. It's a border city in Mexico, again fictional. It's a stand-in for Ciudad Juarez, a city that, even though the image of Juarez, I think, is deliberately being rehabilitated by local authorities there. Again, this is just what I read. I'm not. If there are any who are watching this who are from Juarez, maybe you all can comment more accurately on the situation than I can, having not from there, never been there. The image of Juarez as a city of violence. Juarez from the 90s to maybe 2010, 2011 was known for certainly the hundreds, I'm not sure if the number reaches into the thousands of girls, young women, who were found murdered. Maybe a few people connected to some of the murders at one point or another were in the process of being held responsible, but it is by no means a done deal and a wrapped bow over the whole thing. There's still a lot lingering out there, I believe. It would just be terrible things. I was reading some of the true stories, and Bolaño, he mirrors that approach of just drab, journalistic, just the facts type telling in part 3 of the book. But bodies being discovered in mass graves, mothers who would protest the judge's decisions to be lenient in sentencing for one of the murderers, and then the mothers themselves are assassinated outside of the courthouse. Just terrible, terrible through and through. And I can see why this would be fascinating for any artistic, especially for Bolaño. And he clearly saw something here in how that intersection of art and violence can play out, and where the human is at the end of it. Bolaño certainly, he shoots high, and at first it's not sure if he'll get there, but I think by the end he certainly does. So, moving on. Santa Teresa is the center of this all, of pretty much this whole work. There's another center, a center that is perhaps a little more peripheral, but starts to work his way in. The fabled fictional German author of Archimboldi. See if I always have to kind of go back to the book for these sorts of things. Of Archimboldi, this German author that when we start in part 1, a lot of characters are trying to figure out. But we should, of course, note that this book begins with an epigraph. It is dedicated to, I assume, to Bolaño's children, Lautaro and Alexandra. And he opens with a quote from Baudelaire, an oasis of horror in a desert of boredom. And I'm not even sure if I was able to get to the bottom of tying that into the greater work. But this book is split into 5 parts. Part 1, the part about the critics. Part 2, the part about Amalfitano. Part 3, the part about fate. Part 4, the part about the crimes. And part 5, the part about Archimboldi. Now, so starting with part 1. This section focuses around primarily 4 characters, 4 academics, 4 literary critics, who all share this common interest in the fabled, mysterious, possibly reclusive, possibly not, German author Archimboldi. And they're always hungry to learn more, to know more. But one of the constant through lines, not only are there many digressions into art, as a few of them go to Switzerland and visit with a Swiss artist, but there is a profound loneliness that all of these characters face. We have a Frenchman, Pelletier, a Spaniard, Espinosa, a English woman, the only woman of these 4, Liz Norton, and then Morini, a disabled Italian man, and so I'll kind of, I suppose I'll kind of get into spoilers for all. I'll try to go part by part discussing these, or maybe I'll do a broad stroke, and then I'll kind of go deeper. So again, part 1 about these 4 critics. They're searching for Archimboldi, and their search converges on Santa Teresa. They hear rumors that he might be in Mexico, rumors that are to ultimately kind of be fruitless, or at least fruitless for them. Part 2 focuses on one of the academic individuals that they meet in Santa Teresa, going a little more into him and his madness, his insanity, him trying to figure out why he's in Santa Teresa, and then through reading of various philosophical texts, he's trying to pair all these writers together and to discern meaning as this inner voice talks to him, Amalfitano, or the characters Amalfitano. Part three, the part about fate, concerns a journalist, real name Quincy Williams, but he goes by Oscar Fate. He's referred to as Fate for the pretty much the entirety of the section. And he is a black journalist writing for a publication that writes towards with a black audience in mind, and he is on assignment to go to Santa Teresa to cover this fight, but he gets pulled in to trying to really get to the heart of violence when he hears about these brutal crimes and these femicides that are happening in Santa Teresa. He tries to learn more, almost as if the fighting, the boxing match it's just a facsimile. It's an imprint of the source, and tying back to the violent individuals that he or individuals, not necessarily that they're inherently violent themselves, but he interviews individuals in New York in the wake of 9/11 that are kind of trying to stir up this revolutionary action. He's interviewing former Black Panthers as well, and there is a sort of dissatisfaction, almost as if he's seeing the representatives of these types of movements, these types of desires. So then that's part three. Part four kind of goes more in depth into the crimes and in such a brutally intensive way. And then part five, we learn essentially it is part five is a wonderful Bildungsroman of sorts, telling the story of Archimboldi. Now that's just surface level kind of diving in, and I'll go a little deeper, but again there's a lot that I'm sure kind of passes me by. Now, trying to surmise the elements that are at play within this work, again, the notion of legacy and the search for meaning. Legacy is something that a lot of these characters wrestle with, discerning a legacy, being the keepers of greater knowledge. But it is ultimately there's a lot of humor at play throughout this book. Especially I get the inference of humor within the part about the critics, just almost about the fruitlessness of the work of the four critics, that even though Bolaño isn't of the perspective that seeking art, creating art, especially literature, and then pursuing that, I think he's more critical and critiquing of this kind of pseudo-academic intellectual culture where that is just nothing more than a kind of a front, a bright sheen that individuals put on their rather sad and unfulfilling lives, or that they're constantly in pursuit of things that will ultimately leave them disappointed, like we see in this kind of thruple scenario that emerges between Pelletier, Espinosa, and Norton. But then there's the search for meaning. This book is about the broader search for meaning. For the critics, that is the search to try and find Archimboldi, this author that has obsessed all of them. There's the need to find meaning in why one is in Santa Teresa in the case of Amalfitano, why these voices are haunting him, why he is drawing these geometrical shapes and connecting philosopher names. This losing of the self, of the meaning of oneself, just in that moment. The meaning of truth, or the search for, I mean, the truth is known, but the search for the deeper truth, in regards to violent human action towards another, that interests Oscar Fate, but then he is almost denied the opportunity to really dive deeper, when we get to part four, the part about the crimes. Uh, and then Archambaldi himself throughout his life is, there is a great identity crisis, and that's another part of this. But then the place of art, is, at times it can be peripheral to the story, at times it can be a little more intensive, but that is there as well. The great, and again, the human tendencies, as I've said before, that this is centered around humanity as artists, and humanity as violence, or is art of violence in and of itself, a creative of violence, and attitudes that, but that our human tendencies are in what we are interested in. We are interested in the things that perhaps we know can have no rational meaning, at least not in terms of the individual, but in the broad sense. Resident within part three, when there is the penitent, as he is known, this man who goes to these churches throughout, I think maybe not just in Santa Teresa, but in Mexico, and he'll kind of cause a ruckus. He'll smash statues of saints, and then he'll piss himself, and he just keeps pissing, and he's known as the penitent, and that is kind of the first, of Bolaño drawing attention to it, when the journalists are sent to cover that story, but then constantly, again and again and again, we get page after page after page, section after section. I mean, part three is a slog, but it is intentionally set up that way. So you can never really even be disappointed with Bolaño, because that is what that section is like by design. It is meant to turn readers away. It is meant to become a blur, because then when you're realizing that the stories you're reading about young women and girls brutally murdered in just and assaulted in the worst, most horrific of circumstances, when that starts to blend together, we realize that we do the same thing, within our own lives, when we see terrible stories on the news that just kind of repeat, and it's this perpetual cycle of violence, that has no meaning. It has not and when I say meaning, I do not mean meaning in a positive sense, that there was a positive reason why these violent things happened, but that meaning allows, and especially in these in seemingly violent acts, or random violent acts, when meaning is established, that can then lead to closure, and understanding, and growing from it, when you can kind of get to the root of the problem. But then that doesn't happen, and I get that I'm kind of going off from tangent from where I wanted to get. I'm thematically and then going in each part, but we have that tendency towards the flashy and the bizarre, and then death is key as well. It's almost the most universal of experiences. That whether that is perpetuated in the violence, or if the if violence is met, or in that creative act, we are always kind of running up against the clock. The intellectual see that. Archambaldi sees that himself, too, in his writing. But then it says it's death is as cold as it can be, but any vibrancy in what is created is ultimately just aligned with that. It is a reflection of death. It is a reflection of mortality. It is not, perhaps it is inherently meaningless, because it cannot ultimately have a discernible legacy, and a legacy that will be like with critics who clash on what one thing means versus somebody thinks that a certain text means another thing. True unifying legacy cannot potentially ever be achieved, and that's what I think starts to terrify these characters. And excuse me, so trying to get in. I'll perhaps go most in depth, I think, here into part 5, and again, I'm already at past the 25-minute mark here. So if anybody's still watching, so this reaches its climax. The backbone of this book is, of course, part 3, part 4, the part about the crimes, because the cycle of violence that is seemingly without end. There are brief moments of reprieve, but it's constant. That is the central backbone. If that is the backbone, if that is the bones, the kind of the muscular system, the nervous system is part 5. It's part 1 and part 5. And part 5, and I'll be spoilery here. So if anybody is still watching and by this point and hasn't read 2666, I don't know what you're doing here, but go read the book. So part 5, we learn right off the bat that Archimboldi, and again, this completely fits with that notion of identity and the purpose involved within it. Archimboldi is not Archimboldi. He's Hans Reiter, and he is and I just love the of Bolaño kind of always going back to the one-eyed mother and the one-legged father, where he is raised and I'll kind of flip back to this part, but where he is alone at first, and he is there's the great imagery of the forests, him wandering into it, and then when he gets to know the Baron, the Baroness, and then when he is shipped off to war, and the kind of almost the callousness of what he views, he's always looking for Archimboldi is, or Reiter at that point is, he's always looking for he is missing something within himself, and that is first achieved when through text, through a work, and it's not a published work. It is when, and I'm gonna blank on the characters, on the character names. I believe it is Borisonsky. Yes, Borisonsky. When he finds this kind of horrible diary manuscript, and then when Reiter doesn't even know if he's the one he shot the man in this village. He's not sure if the one that he shot is the one whose life story he is reading before him. But he feels a kind of kinship, a kind of connection. He is wanting to kind of to see that. And then we, as he moves on within his life, he starts, I think, to write. This expressiveness has been building up in him during the war, but it almost just it suddenly comes out of nowhere. But the act of writing, when he finally starts sitting down and starts writing books, it comes after the aftermath of committing an act of violence. Or, I mean, it happens almost so quickly. I wasn't even sure that that Reiter was telling the truth at first, of the man, a Somner, I think, that he, it appears, he alleges to have killed. And when he's then in a relationship with Ingeborg, and her health starts failing, and there's I mean literally this kind of frenetic, even sexual energy between the two that is constant and it's pervasive, and it is as they know she is reaching her own mortality, and as they're kind of as that sexual relationship just becomes so intensive, it is almost as if they're trying to all the acts that they participate in are maybe they think it is almost kind of an antidote to death. They are in there living, and but they are constantly staring death in the face. And then there's that beautiful scene where they're kind of in the middle of nowhere. And I think it's when Ingesberg, she just looks up at the stars, and it's this sense of, being smaller than a grain of sand on the cusp of a beach, or on the cusp of on a beach on the cusp of the water. And Reiter, and she dies, and then Reiter, by that point already assuming Archambaldi, as if he has to reinvent himself after a violent act, or a violent act that maybe, if not fully truth, that he assumed, and he bore the weight of. He must assume a new identity, and then he hides himself, and then he writes, and writes and writes and writes and writes and writes, and that kind of isolating measure, whether it's him trying to connect, whether it's him trying to leave some sort of legacy behind, and that despair, and that loneliness, I think it does pair well to kind of that perpetual just dreariness and stark violence of part four, of meaninglessness, of seeking to find meaning and ascribe meaning, but what violence can lead to. And violence in his case just leads to him producing literature that gets a following, but he doesn't want to be found. He doesn't seek that out. But he's always kind of hoping that his sister Lotte will reemerge in his life, and by the end he eventually does, when and of course, and then it kind of all ties together with his nephew, Klaus Haas, being one of the prime suspects that gets arrested in part four. And he travels to Mexico. I mean, he meets Lotte. I believe it is in Germany that he meets her. But then he travels to Mexico, and then this kind of, it's again constantly, and I don't even know if I'm making sense at this point. But there's the great scene at the end, where the leg, and it ends with talking about a mysterious legacy about this ice cream maker, Fürst Pückler, whose main interests were botany and gardening, but who writes all these little books. But in the end, he is best remembered for lending his name to a combination of 3 flavors of ice cream. And Archambaldi says, I don't know what to think. This man says, no one remembers the botanist, Fürst Pückler, now. Nobody remembers the model gardener. No one has read the writer. But everyone at some moment has tasted a Fürst Pückler, which is best and most pleasurable in spring and fall. Why not in summer, asked Archambaldi. Because in summer it can be cloying. Ices are best in summer, not ice cream. Suddenly the park lights came on, although there was a second of total darkness, as if somebody had tossed a black blanket over parts of Hamburg. The gentleman sighed. He must have been about 70, and then he said, a mysterious legacy, don't you think? You're right, I do, said Archambaldi as he got up and took his leave of the descendant of Fürst Pückler. Soon after he left the park, and the next morning he was on his way to Mexico. As if he'll find answers there, as if his pursuit of the meaningful will find its residence in the state of meaninglessness. or because if he simply wants to go on a vacation. We will never know. And all of that ties in greatly to just the mystery of this whole book, this beautiful mystery. It's rare, I think, for me when I read one of these great postmodern novels that I get to the end of it, all the way to the end, and I almost want to go right back to the beginning and start, or go back to the beginning of each of the individual sections and just read them through. I can totally see myself doing that and really diving in and really taking notes and trying to get to the heart of this, because again, this is from my own first reading without taking many notes besides what I just scribbled down before I sat down here to talk about it. It's just it's great, and it's kind of, the more I think about it, the more its greatness grows, and the more I want to return to it. Which, of course, that's the hallmark of all great books, great literature in my mind. If it makes you want to return to it and want to investigate further, not because you felt gypped that kind of didn't get something that you were entitled to, but that you were given a little piece of something to take back with you, but yet you know that there is more within this heart if only you search farther. And again, the irony is that there might not be anything left in this damn book, but that alone makes it just wonderful to just dive back into repeatedly. One could spend the whole rest of their life just within the pages of this book. And again, and I know I said it at the beginning of this, but just Bolaño's, his prose is just, it reads almost as if, again, a removed, detached narrator, but then you get these flashes of brilliance, or flashes of beauty that ties to the brilliance of everything, and it just moves along and it keeps trucking. There are some authors that could make a 900-page postmodern novel and it be an absolute slog, but Bolaño is not like that at all, at least not for me. So, we're almost at 40 minutes. I feel like I could say more, but I do not know if it will be anything of substance or meaning. So I think I will leave it at that. 2666, 2666, 2666 by the great master. If you have read it, let me know what you think. And as always, I will see you guys next time.